Get in. Ellen is trying to get in.
Okay, you're live.
Hello, my name is Neil Leach. I'm the director of the new doctoral design program, the DDES at Florida International University, FIU in Miami, Florida. This is a 2-year non-residential program that started this week. Today's a very special day because it's our first lecture in the series Miami Urban Studies, where we look at Miami in the broader socio-cultural, political and economic context. We have a series of lectures that are lined up. The first few will be looking at the architecture of Miami. John Stuart will be talking about Mar-a-Lago this week. Next week, we have Patrick Schumacher joining us to talk about Zaha in Miami. And of course, Zaha famously used to spend her winters in Miami. And tragically, of course, she died while she was in Miami. She owned a property on the front there, and just recently, a building designed by Zaha Hadid architects opened in Miami, 1000, the new tower block. After that, we'll be looking at more generally some of the other architectural works in Miami. Miami has been very fortunate in recent years in attracting a number of high-profile architects, Herzog and de Meuron, Frank Gehry, OMA, and so on, to design buildings there. The series continues with a series of cultural portraits about Miami, looking at the more colorful, shall we say, aspects of its life, the murder of Gianni Versace that happened in Miami Beach, the Cuban immigrant population there that adds a certain atmosphere to the place, the South American population, and so on. And what I think distinguishes Miami is that it's a city of immigrants. In that sense, it is in some ways the least American city because many of the people speak Spanish there. It is also, I think, the most American city because if America is a country of immigrants, Miami is itself very much a city of immigrants. We'll then look at some of the sort of more interesting aspects of the ecology of Miami, the Everglades just to the west of Miami itself, the coral growth in Miami, and so on and so on. This is a series that will be broadcast every single Friday at the same time. And next week, we look forward to welcoming Patrick Schumacher for the session on Zaha and Miami. The title of the theme that I've given to the series is Miami, Do You Love Me? Miami, you might not know, is the Italian for you love me. So the question, Miami, do you love me, kind of echoes that in some way. It also implies to some extent a kind of a certain sort of narcissistic edge to certain things, which maybe offers us an interesting entree into the today's session, which will be about Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago, of course, we know has been the sprawling residence on the coast just above Miami in Palm Beach, has captured the world's attention largely because of its famous owner, Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, seen here on this photograph. Trump has treated the building as his winter White House and even hosted foreign dignitaries there for official visits. So Mar-a-Lago has been thrust into the public attention recently, but very little is known about the history of the building, who designed it, what roles it played, and so on, and how has it evolved to become what it is at present. So for today's lecture, John Stuart will be looking at this and looking also, we hope to open up into more broader questions about the politics of space and how we can reflect on Mar-a-Lago and its association with Donald Trump. So today then, I would like to welcome John Stuart to give this lecture. John is, in addition to being a wonderful colleague at FIU, he is the director of Miami Beach Urban Studios. And I should say that we had initially intended to hold this series of lectures as part of the minimal residency that we have in this program. The program is a 2-year program. It's a doctoral design program. And as part of the program, we have 2 residential periods in Miami Beach itself. This year, unfortunately, we are unable to take that opportunity, which is a great shame because Miami is absolutely gorgeous this time of the year, but instead we're going online. So this is then going to be a series that we're going to be broadcasting, and we will keep the archives of it so you can consult it later on. Anyway, I'd like to hand over to John Stuart, who's who is also, his position as a university distinguished professor, and he's certainly an author of some very fascinating works, including, I would say, a history of Mar-a-Lago itself. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Neil. Well, I just want to say how good morning, everyone, and I want to say how impressed I am by by what you've been doing already with the Doctoral of Design program. It's a very exciting project, and I want to welcome all of the students who are here from the program, and indeed confirm that it is a beautiful time of year to be here. It's beautiful outside right now. In Miami and Miami Beach, where I'm located, and that would be a delight to have you all here next year when this happens again. But when Neil was mentioning, my background is really started as a classicist and applied mathematics person, interested in kind of how language and meaning come together, and went to study classical archaeology at Princeton, where there was where I was putting those pieces together, and then kind of went on to Columbia to study with Bernard Schumi in his first year. And maybe we can, Yana can, okay, perfect. And so the Schumi, I was going to say, was interesting because he had just completed La Villette, and he started to be dean at Columbia after doing this kind of archaeological project in Paris. So my interests are historical and they're contemporary, and I'm really interested in how people and places come together. So this project, Neil mentioned that I had written an encyclopedia entry on Mar-a-Lago. I worked on the Society of Architectural Historians Archipedia project in partnership with David Rifkind, who's an esteemed colleague of mine and a wonderful historian. And David and I were charged with looking for the 100 most important buildings and basically built projects in Florida. And this was back in, I want to say it started maybe in 2014, right around then. And David and I had chose Mar-a-Lago then as one of the places we wanted to study. So I had done a small kind of study of Mar-a-Lago for the encyclopedia. And when Neil invited me to look at this project, I kind of went back and revisited that and kind of was asking questions about what the architecture, how the architecture was formed, but really how it kind of formed a kind of partnership with its inhabitant for, I guess, the past 30 years or more, Donald Trump and his family. So it was, I want to kind of look at that partnership because I think it points to some of the ways in which the 20th century has really kind of formed a platform that allows for multiple narratives. Let's put it that way. And so I want to kind of start with that, and then obviously open that up to what that means. But I first want to say that this morning, before I started, no pressure. I got, people when they usually think of people when they think of Donald Trump and they think of grandiosity, they will think of the Volkshalle. This was an image sent by my colleague Thomas Spiegelhalter, kind of thinking about what kind of Trump's presidential library might look like. And this is obviously a very common. We really think in very grandiose terms when we think of Trump and his direction. And there's a definite reason for that. But that's not really what the talk was about. And I also got a great kind of note from the chair of the department about how Donald Trump beat Palm Beach Society and won the fight for Mar-a-Lago. Fantastic read, Vanity Fair. And I will talk a little bit about that portrait in the background as I kind of try to tease out how the narrative of the building of Mar-a-Lago itself and Mar-a-Lago kind of is complicit in the narratives that Trump later tries to make. And so I will start by, for those of you who are all over the world and haven't had a chance to be here, then I wanted to point out where Palm Beach is. Obviously, it's in South Florida. We're a little bit south of Palm Beach right now. And one of the most interesting things about this, and I think this goes back to the work of the encyclopedia about Florida, is the way in which Florida stands apart, is older than and stands apart from the original 13 colonies that formed the United States. And it was a fascinating history to think that Florida was, St. Augustine had been founded, and Florida was being kind of taken over by the Spanish, and I don't mean that in a positive way, but it was being kind of anyways. The Spaniards were here in Florida at a time when someone like Leonardo da Vinci was working for the Duke of Ferrara on new fortification types that would be needed for multiple geographies, to conquer multiple places that were now no longer just the hill towns of the medieval hill towns and the hill town fortresses that had been produced before in Europe. So Florida was already part of a dialogue about, in kind of a global sense, about defense, about colonization, about globalization, and all of these things from the very beginning. In a way, I would argue that the 13 original colonies didn't enter for more than 100 years later. Now, in Palm Beach is a very, very narrow strip of land. Let me get my. You can probably see it. I'm sure you can see it here. I've got Mar-a-Lago on there, but where the red is, where that red is located. Palm Beach is a narrow strip of land, and it's containing a high ridge of oolitic limestone. In some places, the ridge is upward to 20 to 25 feet above the beach, above the water level, and the place where Mar-a-Lago is located. Let me find my cursor. Okay, there it is. It's not okay. I want to clear this. Sorry. This is. I will stop drawing because I was hoping to draw on this, but it doesn't seem like my cursor is working. So 1 second. Clear. Okay, and I don't want to draw over all the images. So where Mar-a-Lago is located is one of the highest points on this limestone ridge that over in Palm Beach. It's also quite far south of the rest of the central part of Palm Beach. And the city of Palm Beach was founded in 1911. It was a Henry Flagler railroad town. It was Flagler brought the Breakers and a number of other very prominent hotels to Palm Beach in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so the Breakers and some of the more and wealthy people started to come down to Palm Beach for the reasons that we talked about at the very beginning of this talk, which is the amazing weather that this part of the world has during a time when the rest of the country in North America, the rest of the United States is kind of suffering with cold. So it was an attempt to, let me stop, I'm gonna stop sharing for a sec and see if I can reshare and get my cursor back. I don't even know if I can stop sharing, so stop sharing, okay. And now I'm gonna try to reshare. Okay, now I have my cursor back, I think. Let me see, annotate. So I will go to the next slide. And so what I was saying was that if you can see my cursor, it may be gray if you see this. Can you see my cursor here, circling the Henry Morrison Flagler Museum?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, you can. Okay, great. So if you can, I'll use my cursor when I can find it. So the idea is that most of Palm Beach is located up here, And Mar-a-Lago was located strategically south of where most people were living. And this is because Marjorie Merriweather Post and her husband, Ef Hutton, wanted to be far from, as far as they could be, from the hubbub of the social scene that soon engulfed Palm Beach. And that was part of that. And you can see the 20th century version of that, so the later 20th century version of that social scene in the Vanity Fair article that Jason sent me. So one of the reasons why I was so interested in Mar-a-Lago, and I eagerly, when David Rifkind and I were dividing up the 100 best buildings of Florida, I eagerly kind of wanted to do it. It's because I never understood it. I saw pictures from there, and there were pictures of Trump and his family and others, and it was just the oddest building I could possibly. There was never a reference point that I could latch onto. There wasn't that I could understand like how the whole thing worked. And I have to say that one of the most challenging things about this was trying to figure out in the plans where some of the images that I'll show where they were taken. So this is obviously a Google Maps version of image of Mar-a-Lago. You can see where the little golf sign is. This is it's now a club, and this is the central arc, and the central axis is right here. The Atlantic Ocean is here on the right-hand side for all of you who are on the West Coast, to the east, and then there's a beach club, a bath and tennis club down here, and beachfront property. That you reach through a tunnel that goes down kind of under, the tunnel stretches under the area where this path is. Now, I'm not saying that because I've ever been in the tunnel, but I am saying that because on the plans, you'll see that's where the tunnel for Marjorie Merriweather Post was located. We will be looking particularly at this part of Mar-a-Lago, the older part where that was the original 1920s part. There were other pieces that were added by Post in the 1950s, and that includes this building here. So let me and this, of course, I wanted to just present a little bit of what the Wall Street Journal. It seemed like a very appropriate place from which to grab this image. But it was this is kind of an image of looking south, and you can see this apse overlooking the pool and this iconic tower, and all of which I think are quite weird. But and I will explain weird and interesting, and I'll explain why. And of course, there you can see a little bit of the beach club in the background that you can get through this tunnel or above ground. So the main characters in this narrative start when Marjorie Merriweather Post marries Edward Francis Hutton, Ef Hutton, and she decides to move to Palm Beach to seek a plot of land in Palm Beach, and they decide to build a house together. Now they're some of their closest friends are the actress Billie Burke and the impresario Florence Siegfield. And I think that what I was trying to do, and this is kind of maybe the kernel of what I'm hoping you'll remember from this, is that I think from this foursome, and essentially this foursome kind of come together, and but I want to explain a little bit more about them, but they come together to help this house be what it is, but what it is today. And so each one of them comes with their own kind of baggage that I think contributes to the 20th century and 21st century challenges that we have today, challenges and opportunities. So Marjorie Merriweather Post was the heir to the Post and then the General Foods empire. She has her great wealth from the development of health foods. And you can see here, this is the 1920s. This is a contemporary grape nuts was one of their most popular products at the time in the 19 teens and 20s. And it's a compound of wheat, barley, salt, and yeast. And they tell you on the box exactly how to eat it, how to chew it, that you don't have to cook it, that it's already prepared. It was kind of a new way of breakfast. But the interesting thing is that that grape nuts as a cereal doesn't have grapes or nuts. It's an example of a kind of narrative, a branding, a marketing, a ploy that was just supposed to bring together a completely new kind of idea of what you're eating. And maybe you like grapes and maybe you like nuts, so you'll be happy to eat grape nuts. But the idea that this is a completely manufactured, it's not only a completely manufactured product in that it's kind of put together and, as they say, cooked in the factory. It's also a name that has nothing to do with anything inside of it. It's a fantasy, and it's a fantasy that many Americans bought into. Now, her husband, Ef Hutton, and I put a contemporary. I was looking for a 1920s Ef Hutton ad, and I wasn't actually able to find one that was. I mean, he was in a lot of ads because he was a well-known kind of handsome man around America. He did a lot of ads for liners that were crossing the Atlantic, and he had done it many times. But he created one of the early and most successful stock brokerage firms in America, and he was also instrumental, and this goes back to kind of the Wall Street and the Wall Street Journal. He was instrumental in as a person in the financial industry. He was really kind of interested in kind of helping the post-financial world of cereals grow into general foods, which includes Jell-O and all these other exciting brands. So Billy Burke you might recognize her. And when I saw this picture of her, I was like immediately like, I know that face. And I think we all know that face because she is Glinda, the Good Witch of the North. She's an actress, and she's quite a prominent actress. And there's really nothing in this narrative, and I'm kind of throwing this out as a kind of maybe a thought reference, that she's in The Wizard of Oz about 12 years after Mar-a-Lago is completed in 1927, and she's and I think The Wizard of Oz has kind of a lot to do with this, but her role in the film industry is really important because film is an important part. Film, not only cinema as film, but television, and the way in which we set up and kind of use cameras to create to kind of frame views is something that she was working very closely with and was very involved with. And then on the far right, obviously, Florence Siegfield was the founder of Ziegfeld's Follies, which was, and I've got a 1919 ad for Ziegfeld Follies, and Ziegfeld Follies were about beautiful women, about extravagant sets, about the entertainment for men. I mean, there's a kind of a whole, I would say, obviously not only a whole gendered kind of easily kind of conceived gendered role of this, but in his work, but there's also the design and the way in which there's, you can see her here with a parrot, and it's just so interesting as that there's this kind of way in which nature and women are kind of coming together in this piece. So the four of these guys are together on a yacht, and they're coming down from New York with this man, with Carl Maria Gerhard Joseph Urban. Now, I would Joseph Urban would have been, I would have, I needed to write out all of his names because these Austrians had so many names of both genders, that it's not gendered kind of associations, that it was kind of difficult to remember. But Urban was really at the heart of pulling these pieces together. So kind of Joseph Urban had a really interesting career. He started off in Austria at a time, as a young man, at a time when the secession, the Austrian secession, was happening, and when Wagner and Ulbricht and others were kind of really looking for as this says, the new spring, the sacred spring. They were looking for this kind of new integration of nature, architecture, and design for the people. And Austria had recently gone through a period in which the arts, the opera, and the theaters were kind of opened to the public, to the middle class, from their aristocratic beginnings. And there's a good chapter on this in Ken Frampton's Modern Architecture, but it's and many other places. But the idea that this nature and architecture are coming together in Austria in a way that's, and Urban is, in a way that Urban's kind of seeing as a young man. He was born in 1872, and this project was built in, I think it was 1898. And so he's a young man seeing this, but he's not part of the Wagner. He didn't work for Wagner. He's not part of those circles. So he starts to work on, instead of only on architecture projects, which he does do, obviously, he works on other types of projects as well. And I did want to point out that this is the opening in Darmstadt, and of the Ulbricht building. And I also kind of was interested in the way in which this Austrian kind of origin of Urban's introduced also the theater and pomp and circumstance. Here you can see, I don't know whether you can see the guy carrying there's a guy here carrying a crystal at the opening of this building. And it's the idea that there's procession, there's circumstance, there's pomp, there's kind of this the theater of these buildings is kind of built into them, as well as, and I just want to mention the crystal again, because this is Darmstadt, and the crystal was really an important symbol. And I was trying to find our great Wilsonian. There's a wonderful Wilsonian painting with a boy holding a crystal, but the crystal also has all of these other implications for kind of alternative realities, for the idea of fantasy, for connections to nature, for new beginnings, for all of these narratives that are kind of embedded, I think, in this period of time. Now, Ulbricht did work on some projects, and I mean, Urban worked on some projects, and I'm going to be showing. But what I wanted to do, I think, first was to show some of his architectural work in the late 19th century. And this is a project in Hungary that I don't think was ever realized in this form, but you can see that Urban is very interested in kind of these integration, this kind of the multiplicity of pieces and articulation of nature within the building, and these kind of swoopy, almost I would say almost hallucinogenic kind of uses. But they also go back, as this piece on the right shows, to kind of issues of half timbering, to the medieval, and in many ways this period that Urban comes from looks back to the medieval period, itself for inspiration, and to the adventure stories of the medieval knights. And I would argue that there's something in there about the medieval, this reference to the medieval and the this, you know, the knights and the crusaders and this idea of the crusade that's also embedded in the DNA of Mar-a-Lago through Joseph Urban, and that there hasn't been very much kind of written about that, although there has been a great deal written about Urban and the theatricality and the cinematographic way in which he approaches things. This is just a painted scene for that Joseph Urban made, I think, for Parsifal. It's you can see his use of color. He was known as an amazing colorist. He's known as an amazing he understands light in this incredible way, and space is another kind of piece. And I think what you'll see is in some of these early, this is from 1920 with Othello, it's you'll see how Urban takes this background in and his interest in theater and his interest in setting these stages and brings them to Mar-a-Lago, and they form then the basis for later, well, for a Marjorie Merriweather Post, but also for others like the next owner, Donald Trump, to create their own narratives and to create their own, to stage their own plays in a way. And so this is another incredible image of Urban's, another painting of a stage set, also from 1920. And this is, I'm sorry, the quality of this is really not good, but this is Urban in one of his cinematic modes where he's looking at how light plays. And remember, Urban joined the Hearst Corporation and their efforts in creating cinema, and he Urban was part of a number of cinematic efforts at a time when he knew the technology wasn't really up to the standards that he expected it soon to be achieving. So you know, we have something like he was anticipating something like The Wizard of Oz, which became one of the first color films, and he anticipated film speaking, but he was really interested in color and light. And I should also say that just a little bit about Urban's movement. So how did he get from Austria to America? Well, he in 1912, he moved to Boston and started working with the Boston Opera. And when he came to America and started working on sets for the Boston Opera, he also was contracted to do sets for the New York Metropolitan Opera. And he did over 50 sets for opera and theater. He worked on sets for the Ziegfeld Follies, and he kind of developed this enormous reputation in New York, which built on a reputation that he had already established in Europe. So let me go back. Let me go to the next one. Then this is another. Again, sorry for the images, but just to show you the kind of the lighting that he was looking at and the way lighting is such an important part of this project. And a couple of buildings. While so Mar-a-Lago was kind of started and conceived with Mary and Sim Wyeth around 1924. It was taken over by Joseph Urban in 1925, and and it took several years for Mar-a-Lago to be built, and so it was kind of finished in 1928. And during that time, he's still building. He's building perhaps two of his most famous buildings. One is the William Randolph Hearst building from 1926, which is on the left, which has the enormous tower on top of it now. But it's also, I just want to point out, like, the most important parts of this building, the columns, the most, maybe they're not the most important, but they're the most visible, are purely decorative. And columns, you know, are often used for structural purposes. But in this case, Urban chose the columns to be a kind of component a kind of theatrical framing of this office building below that was always planned for a tower that was never completed. The original tower was never completed. The Ziegfeld Theater from 1927 is again another, it kind of is another show of the way in which it's more classical, but it does have these very kind of unusual loopy kind of designs, the big theatrical masks, and obviously the planned sign on top. And it was always meant to be a kind of sign theater, and a playful kind of architectural composition, even if it is a little more classical than what we'll see. And what we'll see is this. This is an image from a very early image. I'm not exactly sure how early it is. I think it's from the 1920s, and I think there's a car down there on the lower right that I've identified as possibly being part of this. So this was Mar-a-Lago as you'd see it from the street. If you're not, it's not as you're invited in, but this is from the ocean side, and you can essentially see something similar to this today. But I just wanted to point out that Mar-a-Lago, in looking at Mar-a-Lago and working on it, Joseph Urban and Marion Wyeth, I think Marion Wyeth was kind of upset that Urban came in and was brought in by the A team that we saw kind of lined up there, and asked to kind of take over the design of the project. And Wyeth eventually said, this is not my project anymore. But in the process of looking at how to design Mar-a-Lago, they looked down to Miami, to Vizcaya, and they were looking at Vizcaya for how James Deering, kind of another industrialist who had been very successful, also in the food business, in a sense, in the farm, in the agricultural business, with International Harvester. But he was. So they were looking at how Deering had put Vizcaya together, and Vizcaya had been in part a brand new shell, but it had been a brand new shell that was accommodating historic elements. And so part of what I thought was so interesting about this project, about Mar-a-Lago, was the way in which they were, these tiles, these roof tiles that you see here, and there are I don't know, over 50,000 of them. I read the numbers at some point, but they're used roof tiles from palaces in Cuba, and they were brought over, from what I understand, and they were brought over and used again in Mar-a-Lago. So Mar-a-Lago would start, and there were other elements too that were kind of brought in, but Mar-a-Lago would start with this kind of sense of being in part a kind of collage of other narratives. Now you'll see in the this is obviously the elevation. This is the opposite side of the side that we were just on. So here you can see the curve of that apse that I pointed to in the beginning, and also some of the articulation of the flora and the flora that's kind of part of this, and some are hinting at the design of some of these unique features. But and this is a terribly small plan. Let me see. I'm constantly blowing it up. I might be able to. I probably can't do that in this mode here. But what I will point out is that there's this major axis here. This is we were just looking at this facade here, and if I'm looking at the main part of the house, and let me just see if the next image is better for this. Stop that. Yeah, so this is where we'll go. So we can go right to this plan, and one of the things that I love about this plan is that it's almost it's almost illegible. It's a puzzle, and it's a puzzle of various kind of discrete moments of theater, each of which have their own character and have their own kind of interest. So we were just at this point where we're looking at this is that axis again. And if you're coming into, let me kind of try as best I can to kind of articulate what I can about this place. Now, this is an 110,000 square foot building with over, I should say complex, with over 50 bedrooms, with more than 30 bathrooms. It's enormous, and I'm looking forward to showing you the list of people who were living there in 1940, just almost 2 decades after it was, less than 2 decades after it was completed. But I'll show that in a later slide. But I've kind of lost my cursor again, so I am going to just shoot. Let's see if I can get this back. I'm going to stop sharing for a bit. For a sec. Let me see, and then I'm going to reshare. So in the annotation, so that I could, just because I want to just draw some. Let me see if I can find my cursor here. No. Well, anyway, down on the, so one enters, and yeah, well, I can show you the tunnel to the shoot, let me stop sharing again, see if I can do this differently. Stop sharing. I'll check the chat. Okay, screen share, close chat. Okay. Oop. Hang on. All right. Let me try this. Are you seeing the plan? Let me just make sure I got that right.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Neil. Okay, see my cursor. I'm going to try to keep my cursor on my computer. All right, there we go. So this is the main entrance to the porte cochere. The main entrance to porte cochere. This is a very important entry hall. This is the kind of main living room where you'll see most of the images are taken. And then this is what was called the baby house. It's a bedroom for where Dina Merrill grew up, and it's a second bedroom. This is called the owner's house, which is also which is entered through this kind of special little staircase here. One of the things I think that's so interesting, and here is the dining room, the kind of, I'll call it the Chigi dining room, the Mussolini dining room, but it's the Mar-a-Lago dining room. And then this is the kind of colonnade that we see so often. And this is a double height space, and these are all single height spaces, and these are kind of houses. And so if you come in, you drive in, you drop somebody off, and then you park down here. And this is, or you leave the car in the garage. But one of the things that's so interesting about this is if you're looking for kind of a main grand stair, you just won't find it. The stairs are all these kind of circular stairs. They're semicircular stairs. When you're going up and down in this building, you're always going through these small, almost secret spaces, like this one right over here. And I just think it's fascinating because we often think of this monumentality as engaging huge stairs that mark the transition between floors. But in this case, all the transition between floors are almost kind of they're almost kind of not very important. And I got to find my cursor again. I don't know why it Excuse me. All right, let me clear this. Clear all drawings. Okay. So so I will go on to the next image. Let me just turn this off. I'm going to go to here and click that off. I really wanted to have the cursor for this, but all right. Let's see. So the next image is the upstairs, where you can see some of the. This is a double height space open to below the main living room where most of the activity happens, and these, of course, are the areas, the houses that are attached, the main houses. So in a sense, it's very it's almost like it reminds me a little bit of a movie, of the movie sets where the sets each have their own location, and they each have their own entry, and within each set a different narrative kind of occurs. So this is a historic image and of the main gate, and as you can see, it kind of announces itself as both you could kind of imagine these little guys kind of holding the torches, the torchères or whatever they're called, on either side of the entrance, being a very kind of typical Palm Beach kind of motif, and Palm Beach was very familiar with Mediterranean, with a kind of Spanish Mediterranean style that was popularized by Meisner. But this is not that. This arch right here is something that's very different. Likewise, when you look through the arch, and I love that the photographer kind of took this, you see head on like this, you see directly over you the arch of the porte cochere, which is an entirely different type of arch. And I want to say that these kind of layerings of these arches in different ways is also part of this story, is part of this idea of different moments for different types of things. So this is this main living room piece kind of appearing here, and I wanted to point out some of the details that Urban was able to kind of achieve on the outside. And I think one of them you might have been able to see, or you might have noticed the gilded ravens or eagles in the image that Neil chose for this talk, the image with Donald Trump in the outside. But this is just so remarkable, and it goes back to those theatrical drawings of Urban's, the idea of the bird wings kind of coming up and holding this balcony together, and these ram's heads, the ram's heads holding the ends of the beams up, and they're kind of at every moment there's a chance for you to kind of fantasize about some kind of different aspect of this. And here again is these are again birds kind of carved into this stone, and they used local iron workers and local masons who were part of the Palm Beach kind of craft scene to make this. And you can see some of that foliage that we saw in the as a mosaic on the building there in this image as well. This is an image from the baby's house, the one that you may have seen on the plan, that has this swoopy chimney. It's it's directly connected to Secession architecture, to Art Nouveau, and these are the windows into this into this room, and I will see the inside of the room in a moment. But it was this bizarre chimney that was something that I really thought was important to see. And then this is a historic image of the same place that we it's kind of second story of this rotunda, where you can see these eagles, the gilded eagles up here, everything kind of shimmering with a possibility of another story kind of emerging from that. And what I'm hoping you're kind of seeing where I'm going with this is that these stories cannot all be the truth. In fact, but these stories, some of these stories from this kind of architecture are very important for envisioning progress and envisioning the future. But the other side of that same coin is the side that uses counter narratives in a way that undermines truth and undermines progress and undermines values that we all hold so dear. So I'm trying to paint this picture that Mar-a-Lago has, because it has one, it also has the other. It has both sides of the coin. It was here's an image from it was hard to find a historic image, but here's the image from the pool with some of these with, again, the parrots that you see here and you saw them there, and the this kind of connection between architecture and nature in the walls here. And as we enter the house, so this is if you drive into the porte cochere, you're looking back at the kitchen area and the servants' areas, and then the image of this. I needed to get an image of the entrance to the project. So here's Mr. Trump with his coming out of the building, but you can see, and it was interesting that the best image I could find of this was one with him in it, because I think if you look at the figures, the other figures that are in the foreground of this image, the figures that are in the architecture, embedded in the architecture, if you look at this, you can kind of read this in a completely new way. The building has the opportunity to read this as a political support mechanism, as well as, in other words, the building is a frame. It's a theatrical set for whatever's inside. And I think in this case, you can easily start to read this with President Trump in it as as a narrative, complete, that includes him and all of the the kind of chaos and the aspects of disorder that kind of are associated with his narrative, and the disruptiveness of his narrative. And I'm not saying that this is the only thing the building's about, but I'm just saying that the building contributes to these readings, to these multiple readings. So this is a historic picture of looking back towards that same door. And once you're inside, this is the introduction to the interior of the building, which is really where Joseph Urban shines. It's one of the most important and most complex, I think, parts of the space for basically an entrance hall. It's kind of got a lot going on between these ziggurats, these crests, these medieval crests, these crystalline star-like lamps, the medieval-esque wooden ceiling, the fireplace that kind of pokes out of the wall, and this kind of the table here. In other words, this has a jitteriness and a kind of a richness of detail that I think is I find very hard to read. It's so complex, and it's also I'll show you another picture just to give you a sense. And it took me a little while to realize that this was actually the same exact room with looking in another direction. And so this is the room. If you've walked in, you walk into the living room right here where my arrow is going. And so you see and I think I may have another picture of this room. I'm not sure. Yes, here's another picture of that same room. I think it looks completely different in this picture, but what I was going to point out is that the living room is anything but on center. The main focus of the living room is this piece here, which we'll see soon. And Trump is most often, and basically, is most often photographed in this room right here that you walk into. So I inserted the dining room. This is a historic photograph of this dining room that's based upon the Chigi Palace in Rome, and it's kind of a very loose interpretation of it, but this is where state dinners are located. In that Chigi Palace dining room, it was the favored dining room of Mussolini. And it's called it was called at one time the Mussolini dining room. And then this is the child's bedroom that was the fireplace in the child's bedroom, where you can see the foliage. You can kind of see it growing out of this ground and growing up on the walls. And again, just a tribute to the secession and the Art Nouveau and this new spring, sacred spring. I couldn't help myself. This was just so kind of weird with this frog in this, but at least it shows you some of the images of the colors. And then this is an example that's, a common image that you can find of one of these stairways. I just think the stairways, the way you go between floors is so bizarre. The stairway is fragile. It's a circular stair. It's got these chains that aren't tight on them. It looks very much like when you go between levels, you're also going between dreams, changing your dreams. So this is the entry to the main house, what's called the owner's house. Again, you can kind of see the way it's not ceremonial. It's almost like going into a medieval I want to say a medieval home, a small home, but it's actually quite large. And here's an image of the living room of Marjorie Merriweather Post, who was notorious for hosting these incredible costumed parties at the house. And here she is in the center, under that place that I said was kind of the centerpiece of the living room. And I'm hoping, because I'm not looking at what's coming next. Let me just go back 1 second. I just think I'm gonna stop sharing this for 1 second. And I'm going to look at something. Just indulge me for 2 seconds, because I just want to make sure that I show you the pictures of the living room that I have. I guess they're coming up. Did I miss them? Hang on 1 second. Got a couple of pictures of them coming up, but yeah. All right. Well. I'm going to put a picture of a living room with Trump in it, and then we'll have another one. I'll save that for that. Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. Let me put this on. I'll go back to here, and let me share again. That was a talk among yourselves moment. So here's where we just were in this remarkable living room. And here's another image of it. This is one of the first images that Donald Trump and Ivana Trump made, Ivanka made with kind of their public image with their staff in the late 80s when they had just moved in. And I'll get to that. I thought I had a couple more pictures, because there are many, many pictures online of this incredible living room with these very bizarre pendants and these columns and arches and this kind of medieval fireplace structure here, with the furniture all kind of gathered in the middle. And this is where Marjorie Merriweather Post was located. Now, I just threw this in there just because I know you're so sick of looking, since all of you are interested in architecture, you're so sick of looking at buildings. And this is nothing but a panel of data. So in my own work, what I'm really interested in doing is looking at who lives in buildings. And I work with students on finding this through census data. And I just wanted to point out that by 1940, before Trump had moved in, obviously, while Marjorie Merriweather Post was still there, but after she had divorced her Ef Hutton, there were over 250 people living in Mar-a-Lago. So when the 1940 census takers came around, all of these pages, well, nearly all, with the exception of the top left, all these pages are names of people who live there. And I think buildings not only have the life of the owner and the kind of main protagonist, if you will, but it also has these incredible incredible other lives. Now, Marjorie Merriweather Post remarried, and she married a guy named Joseph Davies, who was an ambassador, and it kind of it not only it kind of enhanced. She was already interested in Washington, D.C. She had a home home called Hillwood in DC, but she was interested in this connection to DC. And I think this is also very important for Trump and understanding his connection to it. So she built in 1957 this this ballroom that was this kind of grand ballroom. He was her husband was the ambassador to Russia while they were married, and so she kind of engaged in a little more of this. And Urban died in 1933, so she didn't have the original architect of the building. And so this is a completely different style of building. It's a completely different style of architecture, much more formal, classical, knowable, kind of, there is nothing about a second narrative. This is a single narrative building, much like the Spear building. And this was kind of what she built herself to support the connection that she was ultimately trying to make between Washington and Mar-a-Lago when she was trying to make it into a White House, into a winter White House. She first tried to make it into a winter White House during Kennedy's White House. That didn't happen with the assassination. Then she tried during the Nixon period, and Nixon preferred other places and really wasn't that interested. She didn't bother trying during Carter because it was just not something that he would be interested in. So ultimately the house fell back to when she died in 1972, the house fell back to her, was given back to her foundation, and her children ended up selling it and eventually sold it. And there's a good story about this to Donald Trump in 1985, who bought it for pennies on the dollar, and it seems that he bought it because it was so large, and he was interested in the most mammoth place. And I think that's the easy story. But I also think that he didn't know anything about it before. But I also think that he kept it and kept using it because of its complexity and its complicity in the stories that he was telling about himself, about his real estate adventures, about his future. And this is mentioned in that article that Jason showed in Vanity Fair. But this is a piece called "The Visionary" that Trump had made, a portrait that Trump had made of himself. And it was done by Ralph Wolf Cohen, and Ralph Cohen was the most, he had painted the portraits of more royalty than any other portrait painter in the world. And so of course Trump had to have this. And I just wanted to point out that there's something weird about the colors here. That, we talk a lot, obviously there have been a lot of comments about coloration and Trump, and that's a whole dissertation in and of itself. But in this case, Trump, instead of being kind of orange or gold, as he's often kind of attributed to be in the media, or gray, he's red, and he's reddish, like the color of the sky, and his hands are red, his face is red. I just thought there was something incredibly bizarre about the color of the portrait being also an issue even in the 1980s, when he's kind of having this particular one painted. 1989, I think it says down the bottom. Now, there was also the issue of the flag. If you might remember, there was Trump was showing a huge flag and got into trouble with the city of Palm Beach for having such a large flag there. But and he eventually kind of modified the flag. But the idea of largeness, I think, is contrasted in this building with the idea of complexity and counter narratives, and that's where I think this is. Where this building holds most interest. So again, we're back in that incredible living room, and here is Trump with President Xi. And I wanted to close with this image because it's well, first of all, everybody's looking someplace else, so there's another narrative going on in terms of the photography. But I also like the fact that they're sitting in the middle of this asymmetrical room. You can see even in the background, there's nothing symmetrical about this room. They're they've kind of formed themselves into this little stage with the flags behind them. I think it's also interesting that, you know, the red flag, you know, who's wearing red, who's wearing blue. But it's also kind of this, I also wanted to point out that it's the stage, it's the backdrop for, and maybe it's the gilding that's the most important part of this, but I think there's more to it. I think there's more to the kind of the layers of Mar-a-Lago as a theatrical set that contribute to the complexity of portraits like this, but also to moments like this, and to the way in which people kind of understand their people being leaders from around the world understand how they're dealing with this administration, and it played a kind of significant role in there. So I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm going to see if there are any questions.
John, thanks so much. That was wonderful. You know, a couple of things that struck me when I was when you were talking. One was I used to have a post at the University of Brighton in England, and I don't know if you know this, but Lewis Carroll supposedly wrote Alice in Wonderland there. And from Sussex Square, there is actually a tunnel that goes down to the beach itself, which is often interpreted as maybe being the source of the rabbit hole in the story of Alice in Wonderland. And I was kind of reflecting on also the kind of theatricality of Mar-a-Lago and the theatricality of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, designed as a kind of pleasure house, a kind of a retreat for the Prince Regent by Nash, and which of course is an extraordinary building in terms of theatricality anyway, because on the outside it's kind of Indian. It's kind of amazing. On the inside there's all this chinoiserie, and there are snakes hanging from the gondoliers, which has a certain resonance, shall we say, with people we're talking about today. But what I was really struck by in this, Alex, a remarkable bit of classical archaeology, actually, John. I thought this was a real kind of Benjaminian sort of attempt to kind of like find these hidden layers, and it was beautiful drawing it out. But what came across as remarkable, maybe I guess when you think about Mar-a-Lago, you cannot help but think about it in terms of its associations today. But I was struck by the kind of how the history made it the perfect place for Trump. I mean, the grape nuts and the kind of fake branding of grape nuts that were not grape nuts, the kind of the actresses, the beautiful women, the movies, the alternative realities, the divorces, the undermining of truth. So many of these kind of comments you were making kind of resonate with Trump himself. So I thought it was kind of astonishing in some way. What I was going to show, but I think I'll keep it, I'll not show it now, but it's to say that the other thing that it kind of struck me about was a while back I was involved in Romania, and I produced a book called Architecture Revolution, largely about post Ceausescu Bucharest and Eastern Europe. And one of the interesting things about the palace that Ceausescu had built but didn't complete was the way it's kind of like its position. It's kind of an interesting kind of lesson for us. When I had organized a conference there, and Frederick Jameson was one of the people who came. I invited Slavoj Žižek, and he accepted, but double booked and couldn't come. But Jameson was there, and we were looking at this palace. And of course, architects think, I mean, very much in the style of Donald Trump, shall we say, and architects were horrified by the Paris palace, but actually mainly because it was this kind of postmodern kitsch. And we were looking at it saying, what a terrible building, you know, and I think a terrible political building. And I think what Jameson said is, no, the building itself is not bad. No, there's nothing wrong with it, you know, politically, the building. But what was wrong was the kind of the way that people were kind of a whole section of Bucharest was demolished in order to make way for not only the building itself, but also this huge kind of grandiose Parisian boulevard that led up to the thing itself. But what is interesting is the way that the building, actually, although it was built by Ceausescu, has been actually has lost its association. And I think the kind of the politics of association are kind of interesting in the way that Trump adds a gloss to Mar-a-Lago as well. It's lost its association. It's now been reappropriated as the House of the People, the House of the Romanian Parliament, and it is actually the most popular area of real estate in Bucharest itself. And that question about how things become tainted or branded, as it were, by a kind of politics association is kind of interesting. And you think about the way in which people tend to treat buildings where bad things have happened, and the tendency has been to demolish them. So you remove the memory of something. This happened in the UK, the house of Fred and Rosemary West, where they'd before they had these murders and buried these victims underneath the building. It was demolished. It was demolished, but nonetheless, despite the fact it was demolished, people still go to the site as though it's a kind of the dark tourism, as it were. And there are other sort of similar kind of questions. I mean, Marina will tell us about the Naval College, I think, in Buenos Aires, which, of course, the mothers of those who had been lost, they insisted on keeping the building there to try and keep the memory alive. And yet you don't necessarily keep that memory alive. I mean, one of the things that Jameson said, which is very controversial among architects, because architects think that everything is automatically always political. He said that basically the building was inert. It didn't have any particular meaning, but you have to understand the kind of the allegories that by the associations of the building itself to see how it, how it is being politicized. So there's this kind of gloss, this kind of branding, this projection. And the idea of projection, I often, when I'm talking about this in my lectures, I use the work of Christopher Zizko, who has this amazing performance in London where he projects onto South Africa House in the time of apartheid. He projects a swastika onto the thing. And what was interesting is how that swastika came to kind of to manifest or represent the regime of apartheid. Now, what was interesting also is as soon as when Nelson Mandela took over, then suddenly South Africa House lost its swastika. So I think this kind of the politics association is really interesting and astonishing in terms of what you were discussing. But I don't want to say too much. I was going to leave it open to conversation. This was absolutely fabulous lecture, John. I think it was, I mean, extremely interesting for me anyway. But, so I want to leave it up. What we have with us today is I wouldn't say students because many of them are very distinguished, but are candidates, DDES candidates on the Doctor of Design program. So I'd like to invite, and also we have my colleague Gray Reed here in the Zoom chat. So I'd like to invite some questions from those who are on the Zoom chat. And I don't know if we'll be able to get any questions from the live stream as well, but that'd be good to bring those in. So please.
I have a question. This is Jörg. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks. This was a wonderful lecture, and it reminded me from the Austrian set up, the Heldenplatz in Vienna, and also these castles, the floor plan, and then you're going over and going into the interiors, and you see this assemblage of you see Alhambra elements, you see elements of various styles and overlaid and over superpositioned into this theater set. But it reminds me very much also on Neuschwanstein, the German castle, which was built by Ludwig II in the end of the 19th century, 1860 to 1890, which has a very similar, it's actually the Neuschwanstein castle is the castle which you nowadays see in all the Disneylands. It's like actually, and this castle was also super. It was actually, there is the Wartburg, which is like the castle where Martin Luther wrote the Protestant, where he escaped and he had his refugee, and he's writing his pamphlets about and introduced ended the Catholic Church in Europe. And parts of these castles are actually the floor plan of Neuschwanstein. And then Neuschwanstein has also these spiral staircases. It has, and then Neuschwanstein has an incredible. There's like Ludwig II had these crazy ideas, and he asked also a painter from the theater in Munich. And he was becoming his architect because he could visualize all his ideas in drawings, and then he get the best engineers to put steel beams in it and to make things inside the castle that were like not possible. It was the first castle, I think, with electric light or with there was like there's incredible technical elements in this castle back in these days. And then he also did other stuff where he put like other small castles that are not so known. Like he did a mountain head, like a little cabin on the top of the mountain, which is like from the outside looks like a normal wooden shelf. And then the inside there is like on the ground floor is kind of normal, but then in the upper floor you have like an Arabic tent inside. So this is like also this kind of I think these kind of leaders, they had always this craziness of vision. And then I think when I now putting it, and that is now the question is like, I mean, and this is also going to artificial intelligence, when we now what we are like actually where we are like looking into it. And this is like a lot of what we use, what we see for the moment, how artificial intelligence is used, that we are that you're taking parameters and you're like kind of mixing them together, and you're seeking a new style. And this is actually also happening somehow in Mar-a-Lago, and is happening in some of these other leadership castles that are like taking source and inspiration from everything, because they are not so self-confident to have a clear line. I don't know. I mean,
can I jump in on that? I was just going to jump on that because I was wondering how you're going to finish that sentence, because that's the most one of the most important parts of this. Why? And I think one of the things that and I'm constantly looking at our moment in time as being a kind of late Roman Empire-ish moment, or a kind of like an early. I almost think of like through the 3D printing as kind of this neo-medieval or medieval type of work, and I think we're looking at the medieval period. And I think this is one of the interesting things about the Austrians looking back to the medieval period and the Expressionists and others, because it kind of countered this kind of dominant narrative, but it produced other possibilities of other narratives. But it also looked back to a time when, great battles for Christianity were taking place, huge battles for and against the Roman Catholic Church. Like there were just enormous divisions. You were either on one side or the other. And I'm wondering if there's something about that narrative, the medieval narrative, that's contained within buildings like Neuschwanstein, as you point out, but also buildings like Mar-a-Lago that allow them to kind of shimmer and resonate with the politicians and others that are inhabiting them.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit that in medieval times, of course, your status in society was projected by your clothing. And so you could step into clothing and assume a role. And of course, we still do this in the judicial system and so forth. And for the house to be this kind of clothing and presenting a role into which you step, which is really, so I was thinking about that kind of whole social structure in contrast to a modernist structure, which was so obsessed with honesty in this, and in stripping away all of that ornament in order to present people kind of in this stark way that is presumed to be honest. And so I'm thinking of the trappings of honesty as well as the trappings of these roles.
Can I just jump in there, Greg? Because that's an amazing point. And just it goes to Marjorie Merriweather Post and the building of this building, because not only clothing, which are, as you're absolutely right, but clothing and the cars that you're in, like the technology that you use to move, are part of your clothing. And she had a car, a limousine specially made with an extra 5 inches over her seat in the back seat of the car to accommodate her hats, which she could not possibly take off. So there's this idea. I think you're absolutely right. And that's what I was kind of pointing at, trying to, in the last image, it was also also clothing is very symbolic, and it was a great point.
Yeah, I want to go with this because Okay, first of all, thank you for the lecture. It was incredible. It's amazing, and I'm also super happy to be here in our first lecture in the DDS. So I was thinking about some aspect that Neil mentioned, and now that Gray is talking about honesty, I was thinking about, I mean, I would like more to not to stop in the idea of representation, and more like focus on the process in order to see what is behind this idea of representation. Because what I could see is like, in a way, this curiosity cabinet that you have in the building, like this kind of eclectic styles and everything, can be in a way, a certain point, a kind of a simulation of a palimpsest of different times and even different places. But behind all this is like a huge idea of colonization. I mean, I can have the whole world in my house, and I'm the owner of the world. I mean, so more than that, my question could be, how do you think that the building influenced their owners, or how the owners influence the building? I mean, how is this feedback, or how is this mutual influence? I mean, Trump changed after living in Mar-a-Lago, for example, or how Mar-a-Lago changed after receiving Trump, for example. So that's my question. How do you think that this, because it's a complex process, how do you think that this process go on here?
I'll just add that it's a great question. And I was looking for clues between the historical photographs and the photographs with Trump in them for how the building had changed. In fact, it changed very little. And which made me kind of think of this as this pas de deux in you know, kind of between Trump and the building towards you know, colonization, absolutely ideas of colonization like you're mentioning. But I would also argue that there's a certain kind of power in that friction between sets. So if you can dislodge somebody from the narrative and kind of make them enter into a new narrative, when they move, say, from your vestibule into your living room, or from your living room into you immediately have the upper hand. It's a kind of almost a military operation of moving, of surprise. And I want to say that this idea of moving from one narrative to another, the dislocation that and the kind of maybe the distraction that occurs to the guest is something that you take advantage of. And in that way, I think the set is kind of part of that process. I also would like to know much more about how it was designed by Urban, and that's just something there's so much more work to be done on this.
Yes, of course, more if you understand like the history of the building, like a generative process, you can like deconstruct all this process to understand the different logics that are, and also this what it means to have narratives, make it by different narratives, like absolutely different narratives, how they go together. They are overlapping, they fight each other, or they are like, I mean, there is a really interesting study to do with that.
Yeah, and how you control everybody in the space. No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
You're onto something super interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah, I know you're lit up as yellow. Does that mean you're going to join us with a comment? No pressure.
No, John, I think this is this should be a book. Actually, this should be a book. I think there's so much here that is, you know, the more of these layers that you're uncovering, you know, and that's in part why I think that I guess we have a background in the classics. I was translating Alberti, and I spent, while I was translating Alberti, one of my housemates, Nigel Spivey, is a classical archaeologist who's now a distinguished professor in Cambridge. So I share that sort of background, but I think it's absolutely fascinating how you can kind of like, there's more there to be, the further you dig, the more there is in terms of these kind of sedimented layers of history, which, but I do think that it has this, as Marina was kind of saying, it has this, it's kind of quintessentially kind of postmodern. It becomes a stage set, in a way, almost a theme park, shall we say? And I think there's a kind of role playing that goes with that theme park. So it's kind of, it has that Disneyfied aspect, which makes it an incredible interest of study.
No, I think there are two things I just want to bring. One is at the very kind of financial top of that, which was, there was a need in the 1920s for the richest of the rich to have the most, like the royalty of Europe, to have, as you mentioned, Brighton, to have the most entertainment possible. So there was this breakdown at the top where you had to kind of have these narratives that were so outlandish that because you were otherwise bored, or you were not popular, or you were not a sensation. So there's that. But I also think that there are multiple narratives in the, like, and what I would do, I mean, what could be done is you could go through those 260 people who lived in Mar-a-Lago in 1940, find those who are still alive, and kind of find all these counter narratives to those, because for all the narratives that are top down, there are many more narratives. And I think that's what's so interesting, is that we're looking at a president that has also both of those narratives in his wheelhouse in a way. I mean, they're, so I think you're right that the building has this great potential to reveal, if there really were 260 people, I mean, that's a living on the site, like for the auditor, for the census takers to find, then that's an enormous number of counter narratives about that place. And I think in the article that Jason mentioned, the Vanity Fair article, I haven't read it recently, but I think they even mentioned that some of Marjorie Merriweather Post's staff came over to work with Trump when the Trump family moved in. But that other side of it, like, what were they doing? What do 260 people do all day? I mean, like,
they polish the brass.
I know, but how much brass? That gets to that question. That's another layer. We didn't even do the brass layer.
Right. The other thing that I was interested in was the framing aspect, that I'm so glad that you showed pictures with people in them, because the issues of scale and of framing and of pace are phenomenal. And I think that's, well, it's something that contemporary architects are, they're a little less attuned to. So I think it's ironic also that photographs show the building usually empty. And that's a little bit like seeing a piece of clothing, a gown or a robe, on a hanger rather than on a person.
Yeah.
Can I just pick up on that? That's a fantastic point. And I guess in some ways, when I think about these buildings and how the performances that go on there lend a certain gloss to what the building is, I'm kind of thinking about Judith Butler's idea of identity as a form of performance, but the identity of the building, it comes out of the performances going on there, and you can reinscribe the building by having different performances. So in other words, I think about the AA in Bedford Square, now the performances going on there to do with the School of Architecture, it's very different from what it was when it was initially designed, which is presumably as a house, a domestic house. And just around that Bedford Square is where my publishers, Bloomsbury, I'm communicating with them on a daily basis now. They're based there. So, everything is kind of based on performance and what's going on there. And I think, if you don't have that sense of performance, you miss out on so much. I remember going around the Forbidden Palace in Beijing, and the only way I could really understand it was by re-evoking memories of the movie, The Last Emperor. Somehow it sort of brought it to life in some way. And I think I guess it goes back to Bernard Tschumi, the idea that actually the architect of our building in FIU, School of Architecture, that the people activate a building, they make sense of it. And I completely agree that those performances going on that stage set was so really bring it alive in some ways.
And Shumi's event city. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Please.
No, I was just going to say about Tschumi, he had a cinema component to him too, which I think we're not really, because cinema was so, the images of the cinema that Urban did were so unusual. But if you read his lectures on cinema, it's incredible how he was thinking about it as this future. Basically, he was thinking of it as television. He was envisioning this world in which there would be television, and that was and that's so appropriate. And that's another reason why this dance has been so symbiotic. Sorry, Theodore.
Yeah, I was thinking on that issue of performance, and let's say we mentioned that there were different phases to the building, or different aspects, or different like settings, let's say, inside the building. And I was thinking of redemption. Like I thought of the Ode of Joy, like and how you can find it everywhere, right? You can find it for people celebrating freedom to people celebrating, let's say, autocracy or something like that. And I was thinking like. That music can be redeemed in such a way, like how can architecture be redeemed? So like the history that you've shown from Mar-a-Lago, I saw just one phase mostly, like at least to me, like it's something that made sense, kind of the succession to Trump kind of makes sense to me, the way I saw this history. So if we are thinking of a future step for Mar-a-Lago, how can it be redeemed? Is it through another performance, for example, a different type of performance or use of the space, or is it, something else that we haven't seen, like a different view?
No, I think that it's going to be really interesting what happens with Mar-a-Lago when Trump's children take over. It may be similar to what Marjorie Merriweather posted. His children have often said that they love their childhood in Mar-a-Lago, that they loved running through these spaces and being in, for a kid, it must be great. I mean, but what will happen with Marjorie? With Post's children, they were the ones that sold it. So, I don't know. It takes a certain type of person, and this is why when Mar-a-Lago went on sale, it didn't sell right away. There were lots of people buying in Palm Beach. It was a popular place, but not a lot of people wanted this place. And there's something about that I think is it's part of that narrative, like you're saying, about what will redemption, or what will it look like? What will the future iterations of this set look like?
I think
maybe I could just jump in there, John, and just say the redemption question. It kind of reminds me of one moment in Nelson Mandela's history, when during the World Cup rugby, and he put on the South African Springbok rugby jersey on top as a way of reappropriating, as it were, the rugby team, because it had always been associated with apartheid, and that symbolic gesture reappropriates it. I think that's an important thing. And the same happened in Bucharest in some senses. Ceausescu's palace has been reappropriated in a certain sort of way. You don't have to demolish it. You can just simply reappropriate and perform different activities there.
I think there's the redemption is indeed a really interesting question, because what you see, you can also connect. Ceausescu is an interesting example, but you can also connect it to the Berlin city castle, which was the Palast der Republik, and then it was demolished to become a castle again, which is like an absolutely weird. I don't know. To me, it's a weird thing. The other thing, what I also find interesting, what can be a layer of these notions of castles, or like these kind of buildings, is like also that like Neuschwanstein, it has these advantages in structure, same as Ceausescu. For this big boulevard, they moved churches, they put churches on tracks and moved churches like 150 meters. They kept the churches, but they moved them out of these so there were like advancements in technology, in structure, in like to make all these kind of visions happen. And I think that would be also a layer, like how is the MEP, how is the Secret Service, like like all these kind of madness of making this stage being a stage, it must be an iceberg, all to make all this happen. to analyze. I mean, you started with the tiles on the roof. They're coming from Cuba. I mean, this is also already like super insane.
Maybe I can just
Yeah,
just say briefly. Talk about churches. The other interesting example is, and I forget the name of the actual church or the basilica in Moscow, but it was demolished, and that was a site where the palace of there was a competition for the palace of the Soviets, and Le Corbusier entered, and of course this fantastic design didn't get anywhere. The winning design was in fact this kind of totally seemingly postmodern wedding cake, which actually they started to construct and then ran out of funds, and it became a swimming pool for years. It was literally the basement turned into a swimming pool, and then eventually, of course, it's been reconstructed as a church, symbolically. So I think architecture has that role in many ways of
colonialism. All the churches in Mexico or in the conquistadores in Americas, they on the top of the old temples they just built churches. That's what you can find in Mexico and all over Latin and South America.
Yeah, but there is also I don't know, a complex theme behind all this. That is, do we have to redempt a building? I mean, it was building fault. I mean, we cannot say that a building has the same capacity or thought that a human being. They have their own intelligence. They have their own processes. So in that way, to believe that because a building belonged to, I don't know, a conqueror, for example, and then, yes, there is like this other narrative, like, I don't know, Aldo Rossi narrative that there is in the memory of the people. So the people have like kind of representation or identity with that building. But it's the human who believes that the building means that. But in reality, the building is a building. I mean, and sometimes it's more interesting to learn more about the buildings, about what their own agenda, the own agenda of the building, because it even exceeds the author, no? But because when you were mentioned, for example, Bernard Schumi was thinking something like, okay, there is no author in a way, no? It belongs to another theorist, but in a way it's like, okay, the architect is not who have the absolute control of a building, because the building exceeds the life of the architect. So people will change it, users, or I don't know, people who is going, performance is going to change the building as well. It's all about this interaction, but we cannot believe that because, I don't know, for example, an architect who worked for a horrible person, horrible politics, I don't know, Hitler, for example, anyway, the buildings are the buildings. Yes, you can say that maybe in architect mind, there were like a lot of things, their own, I don't know, ideology or everything. Yes, it was there, but it doesn't mean that the building has this ideology. That's why it's just a comment, because
yeah, no, I think
so I don't know if we have to revamp the buildings.
That's exactly the comment that that Frederick Jameson makes. Architecture is inert. It's just bricks, mortar, and whatever. And that infuriates architects. They hate that. They say, no, everything is, well, to my mind, politics is about the practice of politics. And therefore, but anyway, I won't go down that line. But
it's interesting to think that the building may have an agenda that is independent of the architect and certainly independent of, but that doesn't mean it's neutral.
That's Umberto Eco, right? You design something that has a secondary potential function that is discovered over time. It reminds me of kind of like the cell phone, actually, the mobile phone that was intended for businessmen, and then there came a certain moment when the businessman would give the phone to say the daughter going out at night and say, give me a call when you want me to come and pick you up. And it's suddenly changed in some ways. You can never predict in a way that how things are going to be used.
Well, I think that's Shumi's point as well, that the really, the really wonderful buildings are the ones that invite interpretation. And one of the things about Mar-a-Lago is that it's so powerful in its, in all of its ornament and everything else that it makes it more difficult you can reinterpret it, but it makes it a little bit more difficult because there's so much there. And Schumi was seeking a building that would invite you to interpret it in your own way.
But I also just I think there are many aspects to a building that are not only I think Jörg was mentioning this, not only its ornament, its structure, but its location, the scale of the property, its expense, and so if you take, and my point was that if you take, like, the challenge will be to find, I mean, if Mar-a-Lago stays as one giant club, which it is right now, with 20 acres or whatever it has, 24 acres, which is one of the largest plots on Palm Beach, it will be, that in and of itself is part of its character, part of its DNA, part of what will be, it will be a huge factor in its future. If somebody cuts it up and divides it, and so it's a house and multiple lots, and that's another project. And we don't often talk about things like that in architecture, but I think we have to. We often start projects with, site studies, but we quickly leave them and to kind of influence the future. Whereas the site itself remains part of that structure of the building. So I've just spoken about the building and the ornament, but I didn't talk about the golf course or the trees or this closeness to the fragility of its location near the ocean. I mean, in the environmental challenges to Mar-a-Lago moving forward may change entirely its future in ways that I didn't discuss at all.
I wonder if I can ask something about there's something that you mentioned that I really like, and I think is again part of the building. You said that one of the things I love about this plan, you were showing the plan of the building, is that it's completely legible, and I found that very, 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 very nice. I think very insightful, and I was wondering this. I'm not sure if you call it a discrete history of theater, something like that everything was discrete in the plan in a way, like different. And I was wondering more like, first of all, one of the comments for before, I think that makes it very, very foreign to AI, to artificial intelligence that was mentioned. Like all these generative models we have today are more continuous and interpolating between things. This is discrete, something that AI doesn't handle yet very well. But my point is, can we have like today, maybe even like these strategies for generative design that are discrete? Like in this building, we can see that this discrete articulation produces some very beautiful architecture. Is that possible today, or even without this ornamentality? Like, is it possible to have like sort of like generative strategies that are discrete? Because so far, like I've tried, of course, I'm not trained as an architect. I've tried some of these strategies. They don't always work very nicely. They still remain discrete. They don't really join very well. So I was wondering if anyone has any idea of how you could have this sort of, you could use this sort of strategy to design something that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not sure if the building does make sense. I haven't been there, but as you said, maybe it doesn't. So maybe that was part of the allure. Yes.
I haven't been there either, but I think if you, I think from after studying this more, I mean, I know now more than I've ever known about this building, and I don't know a lot about it. I'll admit that, but I still think that maybe if, like, I kind of think about this, just the discreteness and trying to kind of align. It's almost cinematographic. If you align scenes that are, and you kind of think about some way of kind of formulating space that was around a certain kind of narrative that had a narrative jump, and somehow they had to kind of connect, and that these two narratives kind of had to connect with this other, and I'm talking about narratives as spaces. I'm kind of referring to Gray's work on on theater and space, and how she really does a lot of very interesting things with this and has written about it. So I'm not kind of saying this is not really totally original, but it's just kind of, if you kind of take those two opportunities and kind of try to find a way, maybe there's algorithmically, for them to be kind of connected. It's a little bit like what Neil's been doing in his AI, kind of superimposing a fabric on a city plan or building facade and kind of seeing where they go. In a way, I think that was intuitively, something like that was intuitively done to create these kind of moments in Mar-a-Lago. Although it was under the guise of Gesamtkunstwerk, which is like the idea of the total work of art. So that's the irony of the total work of art, like Neuschwanstein. It can be incredibly discrete as well as being incredibly comprehensive, which I imagine a world that was designed by algorithms would also be. I'm sure I didn't answer your question. I wasn't really sure I understood it, but
no, it was good. It was good.
I have a question. Recently, I read the book by Les Standiford about Rise of America's Xanadu. And for me, it was really incredible term because Palm Beach to me, it's really like Xanadu country. And for me, it's also the great example of the grandiose and aristocratic architecture, at least in the United States, where we can see the different architectural styles from Italian Renaissance, Spanish Renaissance. We could see examples of Italian palazzos there, which was literally some of them shipped and interiors and exteriors from Europe to here. And the estate was always, Mar-a-Lago estate was always a focal point to demonstrate the power of money and politics. And recently Palm Beach residents have deja vu when the Mar-a-Lago became again the Winter Palace, for the presidential Winter Palace after President Johnson and President Kennedy. And my question is, considering current social and political drama, can we speculate about what you think could be the future of the Mar-a-Lago estate after the end of Trump's presidency? How it could be used or what can happen to it?
do you have any speculation?
No,
because I don't have the research on to know. I would be speculating too. But when you were posing the question, thinking about it, is there anything that you think should be considered in that discussion?
Like political and social, because right now what we see currently in the past year in the country, right?
I was, since you mentioned social, one of the reasons why I try to do these stories of buildings about the tenants, about people who live there, about not the major narratives, but the kind of multiple minor narratives, which I think AI can be a big help in terms of kind of understanding and teasing apart, especially with a building with 260 people who were living there in 1940. There must be thousands, tens of thousands of descendants of those people now living around Mar-a-Lago or with memories of that. So maybe there's a way to start by creating another narrative around that based upon the people who live there and work there, and kind of see all the other ways in which these stage sets were used, not the ways in which they were used to support presidential power, but the ways they were used to support people. And there's a great story about Marjorie Merriweather Post in the 1930s, using her house and not firing a single person during the Great Depression. There's also a great story of her using the house as kind of a hospital, a specialty hospital that was related to during World War II. So there are narratives in there about this non kind of socialite Palm Beach high society narratives, and I think we have the ability now to start. And when the 1950s census becomes available in the next couple of years, then we'll have many more opportunities to do that too. But I'm not sure what the building should be used for. I think the stories, I think it's always going to be, maybe this goes to Marina's point, it's always going to be a venue for telling stories. And I just think a lot depends on who gets to decide what those stories are. And this was, I think Marjorie Merriweather Post was really interested in who owns the building. She wanted the United States government to own the building. Well, if the GSA was the ones that were determining what the narrative was, then that would be one type of narrative. And I think we have to start exposing many, many multiple narratives to understand the building in a more complex way.
There's a lovely essay by Belle Upton called Black and White Landscapes. And it's about the different experiences that the servants or slaves had in the Virginia manor houses. That architecturally, of course, there were back staircases, and there was a whole network of ways to move around the building for the servants, which were different than the ways that the people who owned it moved around. And it's just a really beautiful study of how the same space can be experienced very differently, depending on what you're doing or who you are.
This also reminds me of the Great Dictator. The same thing happened, I think, with the Wagner music, right? When he was dancing with the globe, I think, as Hitler or as, let's say, and then at the end he had this famous speech. The same song plays. It's the same idea. So it's kind of like a redemption scene. That's why I was wondering what the redemption could be for Mar-a-Lago. Maybe it will be something really similar, like pictures that we just saw, but with different people for different reasons, or maybe something like that.
Oh, can you hear me? I have to talk really close to the microphone here. So what I'm thinking is that, so what makes a building, what brings the political aspect to the building? Because if the building is a building, is it the narrative? This Mar-a-Lago reminds me a bit of Versailles, you know, the tunnel and all these people living there and all the luxury. And so is it intrinsic to the building because of its history, or do you think that it's the narrative, the narrative, the current narrative that brings this political aspect to the building?
I wanted to jump in, John. Thank you for a great lecture. It conjures up a lot of stuff. Being a Floridian and a Miamian now for half my life, the Vanity Fair, if you ever sort of, again, Vanity Fair I think has something of a global reach, or at least used to. Graydon Carter, who was the former editor of Vanity Fair, is a New Yorker, and he famously hates Donald Trump long before Donald Trump sort of became the sort of international star that you all know him for today. I can't remember, a couple of essays before recently, but I guess he has a new airmail as his new, I don't work for him, so I'm not going to pitch for this media, but he actually, he blames Palm Beach for Donald Trump. And the problem with Palm Beach, I don't want to be too uncharitable, but it's this place where sort of all the crooks sort of go with their money to escape sort of, you know, call it good society, whatever that means. And it's a collection of probably the most racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic bunch of people who I think even to this day don't let certain people into their club. And this is the sort of battle of acceptance that Donald Trump has been waging since the 80s with these people, which is of course absurd because they're sort of dirtbags themselves. And this is today, and I don't know if you've been paying attention to the latest news is, there are billionaires right now suing Trump so that he cannot have a full-time residence in Mar-a-Lago because Trump that's where he wants to move. And of course, Mar-a-Lago is one of these sort of deals that Trump has negotiated. And in that deal, you can't live there for more than 21 days. So there's this unbelievable kind of tension. So and this is, again, hot off the presses. The one of the futures is that Trump does come back there and this becomes his sort of home, right? Which is both a kind of escape, but also will become a kind of home base, depending on how the impeachment hearing or trial goes, where he'll launch sort of Trump 2.0. And how he will do that, and this is, again, I think a day old, he will work with architects and surveyors and attorneys to basically take a piece of the property where his residence sits, separate it from Mar-a-Lago to call it as an independent residence, to circumvent the kind of agreement we have. That's what literally is going on right now. So it's this kind of saga of society, which I kind of find fascinating. And whether the picture of it is this sort of melange of Mediterranean, Spanish, who knows what, that is a curiosity, I guess, almost as I would argue in this case as a kind of side story to the kind of major drama that's unfolding literally today, but has been going on since 1980.
Well, it's been going on since 1925. I mean, this is not a new Trump story. Like Marjorie Merriweather Post said, she wasn't going to buy the property because it didn't have a lot south of it that she wanted, and it didn't. I mean, and so she, you know, I mean, it's not new. It's a story of development and on architect and real estate. And I think that's one of the another interesting layer to this story. And we were talking a little bit about subdividing. It's often been threatened to be subdivided. This is nothing new. It may sound new, but it's really he's been threatening this. He threatened this in 1985.
To get the property.
Yeah, to divide it up. But back to Anna's question, I think about about whether it's in, I think there's some ways that you can think of this as both. It's not an either or. Is it intrinsic or is it I think your question was, is it the stories or is it the building? And I think, Claudia's obviously on one side, and I'm kind of in the middle. I think that there are multiple layers to this narrative. The one that Jason just introduced is a very, very important layer to this that's going to impact how we think about the building, how we understand it. It will impact, like Jason was saying, possibly physically, how the pieces come together. And so I don't think I don't think any space is either or. I think they're always both and. And what I was trying to do is point out the DNA. I was looking for this physical stage sets, but I totally admit there's a whole other world out there. And you certainly mentioned, I just didn't want you to go unnoticed, Anna, even though I can barely see you in the dim light. I'm wondering what time of day it must be where you are, but anyway, thank you for your question. And thank you, Jason, for
Anna's in Australia, Melbourne, Australia.
Oh, okay.
We are all over the world.
Night. All right.
Some of our students are in China and so on. Just to kind of comment on that, I guess that one of the more recent kind of example of that was right before the lockdown. I was shopping in Whole Foods, right? And almost all the products have been removed from the shelf. And I was looking for beer. The only beer I could find was Corona beer, right? And Corona beer is no longer produced, but except it is produced. It's just given a different name, In some ways, it's kind of interesting how you can repackage something and relabel something, and it's still the same product, but done under a different sort of name. And I'm also thinking the way that people kind of will use, I mean, I had a house in Cambridge where I bought from Stephen Hawking, and we could rent it out because I could say this was the house of Stephen Hawking, but he wasn't there anymore. But it was still a kind of branding mechanism, and so it could be used both ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be the other side to the story of finding out who the 260 people are. I think buildings have contained within them all those stories. We as people we live on stories. That's why cinema has become, that's why all those things that were in those people were doing, the money, the stories, the films, the cereal, all that kind of the Follies, all that came together. We live on all of those things. So I think that's the magic of Mar-a-Lago in some sense.
I keep thinking about the sort of modernist reaction against this stuff, and also about Morris Lapidus, and his sort of Morris Lapidus. I don't know, for those who was a local architect who was very much interested in theater and in this kind of flamboyant architecture, and he designed the Fontainebleau Hotel. But just the push and pull between the modernist sort of rejection of hierarchical classicism and a lot of the sort of theatrical stuff, and Adolf Loos's essays about the poor little rich man and about the ornament as a crime, and yet he was as racist as they come, So it's a curious sort of moment, and in a funny way, we're sort of replaying it or rethinking about that whole tension of, the hierarchical kind of racist structures and the more, more egalitarian structures. What's the architecture of that? And, how does that work? It's just interesting. Anyway, thank you, John. It's just wonderful to bring all this stuff up.
Just to say, I don't want to go down that line too much, but of course, Adolf Loos, this great kind of like to champion of purity, right? He has a certain history. There used to be a Wikipedia entry that someone's removed, but it's talking about the pedophilia case against him. So it's not as though he's quite as pure as he would claim to be.
You're muted, Jason.
You can be purely bad.
No, I guess that the way I always think about that and what a building can be. I mean, I used to quote Foreign Office architects who would always talk about their buildings in terms of scenario planning. You would design it for a certain set of performances. And I was talking about that, but in the summer, I was in a digital futures discussion with Alejandro Zarapolo, and he said, no, we don't say that. So I don't know where that came from, but I think that, you can think in terms of the affordances, what a building would lend itself to, and you can't have a football match in a telephone box kind of thing, but there are certain things in which you can imagine the kind of performances that go on there. But I think the idea of performances is really important, and the idea of narrative. And I guess from my time at USC in the cinema school, we were very much kind of informed by that, about how cinema was kind of based on narratives and world building. And it was interesting that the two buildings for the cinema school at USC, there was Steven Spielberg and George Lucas gave these two buildings. And what was horrified architects, because there was this kind of like, it looked like Mar-a-Lago actually. And for them, it didn't matter. It's a stage set in which you act out these things. But interestingly, of course, Yan Sung Ma is now being commissioned for the George Lucas Museum just outside there. But we get fixated about the design of the style, but maybe there are other issues that are more important in some ways.
There's also among cinema or people that produce cinema, there's this creative technique that they, when you shoot in Hollywood for a movie or like any other place, then they take like to get up to a new style, but which is commercially successful. You say, for example, I make a new plot and I take Titanic and I take King Kong, and we bring it together and we create something new. And this is actually exactly what you somehow in some spaces also see in Mar-a-Lago. You take one historic element from one piece of architecture, from one style, you mix something else together, and you create these kind of new narrative. And this is like also something what is a discussion also in the artificial intelligence, like that what parameters you feed into a system, and then it's like, do I take a little bit of this and do I take a little bit of this, and the outcome must be wonderful, And I think that's like also like, I don't know. I mean, I think that's where I'm lately thinking also a little bit like, what are really, it's all about, I mean, digital design, parametric design has been always the question on like how you select parameters and what are the sources of your inspiration to come to a new style. And is it so easy that you, like in cinema, that you take a plot which is commercially successful and you take another plot and you mix it together and you have a I don't know, I don't think that I mean, architecture, it's a lot about aesthetics and proportion and also always seeking for new proportions, new languages, new styles, but on the same time, I think it's not that easy. Maybe, I mean, I'm also not saying that making a movie is easy, right? But I mean, and I'm not saying that this creative technique of mixing two stuff together is maybe the best one. But I mean, that's like what's happening a lot. What's being used in Hollywood.
I don't know whether I have a response to that, Jörg, but it's a great comment. But it did remind me of something that I had thought about while I was putting the presentation together that I didn't mention, that I think it would be an interesting article, is to kind of compare Mar-a-Lago or the White House by, I've forgotten the Irish architect's name who designed the White House. By the way, another building I've never understood. I really don't understand exactly the way the White House is laid out. But comparing them, and there might be a reason for that, but comparing them to the Capitol building. And I just think, if you're thinking about those mashups that we've seen, the Capitol building is so knowable. Like whenever we've seen images from the riots of spaces, I know where those spaces are. I kind of can almost picture where the camera's pointed. But it took me, a while to really wrap my head around just that little intro vestibule in Mar-a-Lago, which is so complex. So there's a way in which, but we always associate power with the monumental architecture of Rome, or the monumental architecture which obviously comes from Greece, or the Parthenon. We don't, and those are very knowable spaces, but we, in some ways, I think maybe power, and maybe this is the product of the postmodern age, is the power comes from these more complex spaces where where it isn't so legible, where you're not able to read it, and where it becomes a greater challenge to kind of to understand. And that was kind of, did you catch it, Gray? Oh, good. That was kind of that was kind of the way I was thinking about these some of the moments in the Capitol building when the policemen pulled the rioters away from the Senate chamber, and kind of how they wouldn't know where that was, but it was so close to them being able to know. I mean, the knowability of the building is quite the building's quite legible. So that I was thinking while you were speaking about this kind of the legibility of these monuments to power, like Roman temples, but the power in the illegible building, like like a Mar-a-Lago, or I would even argue like a little bit like the White House. Not to bring a too political a point on this, but Jason, did you have anything you wanted to add, or did you just think that was the most anodyne statement you had ever heard about power?
I just, maybe John, I could say, it's interesting that those who are obsessed with power, dictators, always have recourse to architecture, to remodeling cities. I mean, not Ceausescu, but Stalin and so on. And it seems to be a kind of constant motif that people need to find a way of expressing. Of course, Hitler as well.
Yeah, of course, and that's why I started with that image, because that's where I think everybody thinks this is going. You expect Trump to find his power in that type of environment, and I was trying to help us think that power can be found in many other environments when it's the power that's kind of given by framing scenes, like a television does, or like cinema does, or like your computer screen does. So that we think about, there's a new formulation of it that's related to fantasy. And alternative narratives.
I would say, I mean, to sort of Anna's question before, I think the sort of narrative and fantasies of certain buildings are so strong and powerful that even without knowing what they are, you have to be sort of curious about what's going on here, that there is some kind of, and this, I always think of Las Vegas, right? Las Vegas, the narrative of Las Vegas is somehow a chunk of ancient Greece landed in the Nevada desert. That's the narrative, right? So that's like, an absurdity on top of an absurdity, right? That there's this kind of forced picture that's being created, that these things can't, I think, be inert at a certain point, right? That, like, I think Marina had said something about, you can't blame the rocks and the bricks for it. No, you can't. They're inanimate objects, but some narratives are so strong, regardless of what, you look at these things and you go, well, there's something awfully willful at play right here. And it's not, as some of the kind of credos of modernism, that they're sort of logically deduced as reflective of society at this moment. I mean, that's hogwash of the highest order. Like it's, they're all sort of narratives and they're all willful. So I have to say the artifacts, and certainly when a Trump inherits this house from, the woman who built it, there are like minds at work at the very least. I don't know that they would enjoy each other's company, but they sort of have the same wishes and dreams at hand. So, and who knows, the future inhabitants of this. I think we can almost anticipate who they would be.
Well, by the size of their pocketbooks.
Well, for sure, one thing, and and as the cliche goes, behind every fortune there is some crime of some kind. So, guess what?
Well, I'm wondering if this is the architecture of power and repression, right? And that these repressive regimes employ architecture in order to hold their power, to construct their power, and to make the fantasy that their followers buy into. What's the opposite?
Well, I think it is. I think it is the opposite, Gray. It is because this is also the architecture. The medieval dream is also Disney. It's also the fantasy of. But then Disney itself is its opposite. So I don't think there's any way. I think there are multiples, obviously, contained within these within each one of these containers.
Yeah, and also the spectacle, because I was thinking like how if the American style of life define the idea of fantasy, or is the opposite, is the fantasy which define the American style of life, because finally it's all about this. There is a lot of American architecture based on this. You mentioned Disney World. Okay, there is also. Anyway, I have to say that I'm in La Plata, Buenos Aires, Argentina, and we have our own Disneyland. It was before Disneyland, and I don't know if it's a myth or not, but they say that he came here and he saw this República de los Niños. We say it's like the Republic of the kids, and we have it here, and it seems that it was before the. But anyway, as an American here, South American, we have all this mixture of cultures. So we're based in a kind of fantasy, because our real roots, that I don't know, they're like behind all this, no? So that was my question. American style of life define fantasy, or is the opposite? And
well, I love that reference to La Plata. It's like that place. I think what Disney learned from that. What is it, Ciudad de los Niños? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, República de los Niños. Yeah.
Oh, República de los Niños. I think it was the scale, the 7/8 scale, that reduction in scale. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about a lot has been scale. And we were talking about the photographs and needing people in them to understand scale, also the scale of the property. So in one sense, I think scale is super important, and that's, I think, one of the things Disney said he learned from that project in Argentina. But I also think that it's a constant interplay. That's a constant dance between like who's establishing, who's kind of pushing the who's kind of moving the needle, and what the needle is. What is the needle? I mean, is it, what is American society? I mean, is it, I was just looking while I was doing some research, and I didn't get very far down this little branch, was looking at the top, because at one point Palm Beach was one of the richest, 10 richest towns in the United States. And it's not anymore. I think like 6 of them are in Silicon Valley, but now, and so I was looking at the top ones, and the top images from our architecture in these wealthiest sections of America right now are these incredible modern, from what I saw, and I didn't do much research, but I was just looking at these incredible modern kind of set pieces that would be, kind of like the cinematic backdrop for a murder or something like this. But this is where my mind went. Again, this is not a topic that I prepared for presentation, but it's just something to think about, because there is something about wealth and power and what we, how many people visit Vizcaya just to see how this guy who died in 1925 lived? I mean, people get pleasure out of seeing these things that are larger than life, that are bigger than anything they could possibly imagine for themselves, and kind of the products of those. Like, why did people buy grape nuts? I mean, it was because they believed in this post empire of healthy cereals, of quote unquote healthy cereals. So we believe, and then when we believe, we pay, and then when we pay, we get the belief reinterpreted, because the wealthy person needs more fantasy and needs more delight in their world. And that is one way, from the top down, that entertainment comes down and becomes popularized, and then changes the way in which we think about our own daily lives. I don't know. I just made that up, but I kind of believe it for the most part.
I would like to add also to Marina's question that I believe the fantasy it's part of American culture because in comparison with European countries, which was based on the history and created on the history of wars, tyranny, whatever, America was based on the philosophy of freedom, that anybody based on any religious can come here, own the land and be happy. So, and we have also the term of American dream, right? That's why I think it's fantasy we could see in all aspects of American life, of American society here.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
just to say, sorry.
I was only going to suggest that you read the book. I think it's called The Indian Worlds and George Washington. The Indian Nations and George Washington. It's a story about George Washington, a surveyor and an incredible real estate developer in his own day, and him dealing in kind of like how those notions that you were talking about, those ideals kind of led to his kind of just basically, taking land from nations and subjugating the nations and moving people, and kind of how those ideals kind of led to, I think, a lot of the kind of questions about power and place that we have today in our country.
Yeah, I just wanted to add about the comment about fantasies. I think architects seem to be oblivious to the fact that they are themselves living in a fantasy world. I mean, I don't want to go into the kind of Slavoj Žižek notion that fantasy is constitutive of how we see reality, but it's always at work, and that's an interesting story in itself. But just think about the typical kind of when you have a sort of review of the work. And I was once at a review where someone from outside architecture was there, and she turned around to me and said, well, when are they going to build this? And we said, well, it's not going to be built. It's just going to be, it's just a kind of, and we operate in that realm the whole time. So, and the other thing I wanted to add was, I think the kind of question about Disney and so on is that I think the genius of Disney is not that he found something unusual, but that was pervasive within society. And my argument would be that places like Venice or Paris or those cities, or indeed even buildings like the Bauhaus, are themselves theme parks in our contemporary sort of domain. So he tapped into something and recognized that theming and role playing were precisely part of our logic today.
Which go back to the World's Fairs and go back to, they go back to the Pan-Athenaic way, essentially. I mean, they really are part of the way in which we understand space and pageantry. Yeah.
No, it goes way back where. I mean, that's to go way back in history. Inigo Jones and so on. It was all part of that. Yeah. Indeed, the Brighton Pavilion as well.
Mm-hmm. How long does this class go on? I thought you told me
we should wrap up soon.
I love this, but I'm looking at my calendar.
We should wrap up. I mean, especially for Anna. I don't know what time it is in Melbourne now, but so maybe I could just ask for
3 a.m. Oh no.
Question. Okay, well, let's not. I mean, we have plenty of opportunities to discuss things, and I just want to thank John for that. Was wonderful. I mean, I really
thank you.
I found
Thank you, John.
It was absolutely fabulous presentation, and
thank you, everyone.
Thank you also for the contribution and the questions and so on. Just to say that next week we have also, in a kind of theatrical way, in its own way, we have Zaha in Miami. And of course, there was this close connection, as I pointed out, that Zaha spent much of her time in Miami. We also, our colleagues, John was himself working for Zaha, and also Claudio Bush. So that'll be an interesting kind of session. I was at the opening of the 1000 building that Patrick was there for just very recently in Miami. I think that in many ways that some of these debates will carry on into that. But so thank you. Just to say also that we will be using the same channels for streaming this thing. We are also going to be on Sunday. I will be doing the first of our theories of the digital. The theme is going to be the intelligence. There's also we're going to be there's also going to be a workshop on Saturday on AI that Daniel Bolojan is teaching, for which the DDES students are welcome to join in. I would say that Daniel Bolojan is really one of the great experts, and it's a great privilege to have him there. So let's just wrap up, and thank you for everything. And it's great to launch this particular course with John's wonderful lecture today. Let's hope that we carry on keeping up to the same standard. But it was fabulous, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you.